and we just don't want to show a video. So I asked Pastor Blake if he would be willing to lead a session for us, and he said, well, I don't know, I don't have too much expertise in this area. But then he said, there's this study guide. And so I said, okay. So pretty soon, a couple of days later, he said, I'll do one of those sessions for you. So we're really thrilled because he will bring to us what those of us on the committee have felt was just a wonderful review and overview and exhortation to action. So with that, you don't need an introduction as such, but I just want them to know that you really have helped us out in this program, and it's something that we all have a lot to learn about. So thanks.
Thank you, Carolyn, and it's good to be here, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share. And this is a really important topic, I think, that a lot of people, as we learn more about it, become more and more concerned about, because it is something that impacts our public life and also impacts what it means to be a Christian. And as we try to live into the values of Christ that we seek to follow in the face of communication and information and others that are seeking to promote a different understanding of Christianity that seems quite antithetical to our following of Christ, who we celebrate this weekend as Christ the King, and to our public life as well. And so I'm glad to get a chance to talk about this, and we'll be looking at sort of some of the church's response to Christian nationalism, as well as thinking more about what we can do as a community. So it will hopefully have some more time for discussion and conversation as we reflect on this as well today. And I'm going to be using resources from Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which was a group that was started in 2019 as so before the day of January 6th and that insurrection attempt. And so this is something that has not been just in response to that, but even prior to that, looking at how do Christians respond to the threat of Christian nationalism. And it's a very broad-based group of Christian churches that are working together in this way, including our own Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the Episcopal Church, who will hear the two presiding bishops from in short video segments during our time today. I have a couple of handouts. The first one is Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and on the front side, if you, I guess you can tell which is the front, but the one that doesn't say stand up, the other side lists a number of things that we believe to as we are bound to Christ by faith. And this is, I think, a really good list, and I'm just going to invite each of us to take a turn or I will read each of these statements for us, and just quickly, because I think they're really important for our framing, and it reviews a little of what we've learned in the past couple of sessions, but I think that's okay. Many of you I know have been here, but if you weren't, this will give you a little review as well. But as Christians, we are bound to Christ, not by citizenship, but by faith. We believe that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. Patriotism does not require us to minimize our religious convictions. One's religious affiliation or lack thereof should be irrelevant to one's standing in the civic community. Government should not prefer one religion over another or religion over non-religion. Religious instruction is best left to our houses of worship, other religious institutions, and families. America's historic commitment to religious pluralism enables faith communities to live in civic harmony with one another without sacrificing our theological convictions. Conflating religious authority with political authority is idolatrous and often leads to oppression of minority and other marginalized groups, as well as the spiritual impoverishment of religion. We must stand up to speak out against Christian nationalism, especially when it inspires acts of violence and intimidation, including vandalism, bomb threats, arson, hate crimes, and attacks on houses of worship against religious communities at home and abroad. And then they conclude, whether we worship at a church, mosque, synagogue, or temple, America has no second-class faiths. All are equal under the U.S. Constitution. As Christians, we must speak in one voice, condemning Christian nationalism as a distortion of the gospel of Jesus and a threat to American democracy. So this is the statement that was agreed upon by all of the churches that I'll share with you in a moment. Any comments or reflections on those proclamations, those statements of agreement among these various Christian groups? Any surprising to you, or any that you would question, or which ones, or would you affirm all of them and say, yes, that's what I would hope we would be as a society and as a church? So as Christians, this is a summary of what part of what we just read. Our faith teaches us everyone is created in God's image and commands us to love one another. As Americans, we value our system of government and the good that can be accomplished in our constitutional democracy. Christian nationalism seeks to merge Christian and American identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. And then they conclude, we reject this damaging political ideology and invite our Christian brothers and sisters to join us in opposing this threat to our faith and nation. And then if you turn the page, on the other side, you see all the groups that have made this statement. And this was launched in July, as I said, of 2019 by a diversity of Christianity in America. More than 6 dozen different denominations representing all 50 states, rural, urban, and suburban localities, and a mix of clergy and active churchgoers got together to create this statement. And you can see a number of the denominations listed there, including groups like the African Methodist Episcopal Church, American Baptist churches, the ELCA, Orthodox churches, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, even Southern Baptist Convention. And so the group of churches that officially agree to these statements is quite broad and quite wide-reaching. And I think it's important for us to see that unity of purpose among all these churches. Now, within various churches, there is a lot of difference, as each congregation has its own unique culture and leadership. And so even if a church, as a church body, or the leaders have signed on to this, you'll find a wide variety within individual churches of how they live out or not live out this. And we know that Christian nationalism is very prevalent in many churches around the country. That is why we're talking about it today. So I just wanted to start us with this, and this is an organization that is ongoing, and you're welcome to go to their website and learn more about them. They have things that resources for individuals as well as congregations to help us, and towards the end of our time, we'll talk about some of the next steps that we can do as individuals and as a community. So this just reiterates some of the diversity of groups that have signed on to oppose Christian nationalism as Christians. Part of their work was creating a webinar, and it had several panelists, Presiding Bishop Michael Curry from the Episcopal Church in the United States, Elizabeth Eaton, the presiding bishop of the ELCA, Dr. Andrew Whitehead, who's done the most detailed study of Christian nationalism through surveys and research, and both Pastor Larry and Pastor Libby Howe mentioned some of his work in their sessions prior, and then Amanda Tyler from the American Baptist Church, who sort of convened or was the moderator for these events. And so I'm going to share with us a couple of short videos to get us to think about this topic from a couple of these panelists from this webinar. And the first one is from Andrew Whitehead. And this is his book, Taking America Back for God, that is based on his research over the last couple of years on Christian nationalism. And this video will talk about the different levels of support and people who are opposing Christian nationalism. And I think it's a bit eye-opening. So I'm going to play this for us, and hopefully this will work. And we're not getting the sound, are we? Okay. Let's see. How do I share the sound? Oh yeah, there it is. Thank you, Brooke. I see share sound. Okay. So hopefully this now will work. No sound yet? Okay. Is it still paused? Okay, let's try.
So how do we measure Christian nationalism? Well, in our work, when we survey large portions of the population, we ask usually 5 or 6 questions of our respondents, things that ask them to strongly disagree, to strongly agree with statements like the federal government should advocate Christian values.
Okay,
the federal government should declare the United States a
there,
Christian
Brooke?
nation. That we should allow prayer in public schools, or that the United States, the success of the United States is part of God's plan. And so depending on how Americans answer those questions, how strongly they agree or disagree with those questions, we're able to assign point values and combine them into a scale. And this scale gives us an idea and understanding how strongly they embrace Christian nationalism or not. And so if we move to the next slide, what you can see is that Americans are distributed all across this scale.
Remote control for the
From
projector.
at the lowest end with the white bars, these are Americans who strongly disagree or at least disagree with any of those questions, to those at the highest end, the red bars, who are agreeing, or in most cases strongly agreeing with all of those questions about whether Christianity should be privileged in the public sphere. Any buttons on the side, control volume. And you can see below, or on the next slide, that of the population. We ask usually 5 or 6 questions of our respondents, things that ask them to strongly disagree, to strongly agree with statements like the federal government should advocate Christian values. The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. That we should allow prayer in public schools, or that we measure Christian nationalism. Well, in our work, when we survey large portions of the population, we ask usually 5 or 6 questions of our respondents. So how do we measure Christian nationalism? Well, in our work, when we survey large portions of the population, we ask usually 5 or 6 questions of our respondents, things that ask them to strongly disagree, to strongly agree with statements like the federal government should advocate Christian values. The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. That we should allow prayer in public schools, or that the United States the success of the United States is part of God's plan. And so depending on how Americans answer those questions, how strongly they agree or disagree with those questions, we're able to assign point values and combine them into a scale. And this scale gives us an idea and understanding how strongly they embrace Christian nationalism or not. And so if we move to the next slide, what you can see is that Americans are distributed all across this scale. From at the lowest end with the white bars, these are Americans who strongly disagree or at least disagree with any of those questions, to those at the highest end, the red bars, who are agreeing, or in most cases strongly agreeing with all of those questions about whether Christianity should be privileged in the public sphere. And you can see below, or on the next slide, that we assign labels to each of these groups, or I hope you can see. To the left are rejectors. And so they're about
I think we figured it out. It was the computer there. All right, I think we've got it.
So how do we measure Christian nationalism? Well, in our work, when we survey large portions of the population, we ask usually 5 or 6 questions of our respondents, things that ask them to strongly disagree, to strongly agree.
Let me So back to the research. So he's going to share some research on how do you measure Christian nationalism. Sorry for the long interlude there. Excuse us for that technical difficulty. All right, we'll try this again.
Christian nationalism. Well, in our work, when we survey large portions of the population, we ask usually 5 or 6 questions of our respondents, things that ask them to strongly disagree, to strongly agree with statements like the federal government should advocate Christian values, the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, that we should allow prayer in public schools, or that the United States, the success of the United States is part of God's plan. And so depending on how Americans answer those questions, how strongly they agree or disagree with those questions, we're able to assign point values and combine them into a scale. And this scale gives us an idea and understanding how strongly they embrace Christian nationalism or not. And so if we move to the next slide, what you can see is that Americans are distributed all across this scale. From at the lowest end with the white bars, these are Americans who strongly disagree or at least disagree with any of those questions, to those at the highest end, the red bars, who are agreeing, or in most cases strongly agreeing with all of those questions about whether Christianity should be privileged in the public sphere. And you can see below, or on the next slide, that we assign labels to each of these groups, or I hope you can see. To the left are rejectors. And so they're about 22% of the population, the white bar. So these are Americans who completely repudiate any notion of a close relationship between Christianity and American civil society. Resistors are the blue bar, and they're about 27% of the population. They're uncomfortable with the idea of a Christian nation, but they're more undecided than our rejectors. So they are not wholly opposed, we would say, but they definitely lean toward opposition. And in the gray bar, about 32% of the population, this is the largest of the 4 different orientations towards Christian nationalism, we have accommodators. Now, accommodators are in some sense a mirror image of resistors. So they lean towards accepting the Christian nation narrative, this cultural framework. They're friendly towards it. So their support is undeniable, but it isn't comprehensive. And finally, we have what we call ambassadors, the red bar there on the right. And they are just under 20% of the population, a fifth of Americans in the US. And they are wholly supportive of Christian nationalism as a framework. So believing that the US either was or still is, or at least at the very least should be, a distinctly Christian nation in order to flourish. And again, the Christian brings with it a host of different cultural assumptions.
Any response to that study and the different groups that he mentions? Anyone want to share a comment or a question about that?
So one thing I noticed that over 50% are either accommodators or ambassadors. That's a large group.
Yeah, that is a large group. Yep.
And it exactly matched the Senate vote recently in Wisconsin State, that 51-40. But I thought it interesting, the quartile 1 and quartile 4 was 41%. So 41% really strongly care like one way or the other. 59% kind of don't. We're still like, that's an interesting pair off.
Right. That's a good, so there is a large 60% about in the middle that sort of are either not paying attention or are unswayed or unsure one way or the other, or haven't made up a strong opinion.
Based on what each has just said, and based on the churches that are involved, that you've indicated on the back of this first sheet, what percent of the population would those houses of worship, so to speak, be of the population in the US?
That's a good question. I think when you look at the groups that are a part of this, it's probably a majority of the Christians. That there are some, the ones that would not be represented in this would be more independent churches, evangelical, fundamentalist, and Pentecostal churches are not represented, but the Roman Catholic Church, even the Southern Baptist Convention are all included in this. Although we know that, as I mentioned earlier, many of those churches, church bodies are against Christian nationalism, while many of the individual congregations or leaders may be proposing or promoting it. But we do also know that from recent studies, just the number that was, I think, a total of the American population, and it's interesting that the number of Christians in the American population, or who are adherents of a Christian faith, has gone down a lot over the last 30-40 years, so that it's still a majority, but nowhere near the majority it had been in the past. So there's a difference between those who are Christian versus those who maybe even adhere to Christian nationalism as a belief system or a value system.
Blake,
Yeah.
Pastor, I'm sorry. It does speak to me, though, about the possibility that there are that many people that are waffling or not clear about what they believe, which I would like to believe then gives us the opportunity to think about a measured response to those that are not sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that's a little bit of what Evan was lifting up, is that there are a lot of people who are open to conversation or, being in discussion about this, or maybe haven't thought about it as much. And so I think there is important opportunity for us and a motivation for us to engage in ways that are helpful and can create an openness for change. Yeah. Tyrone.
Yes, relating the charge to the points that you read at the beginning, one of the things that and the points that you read struck me is how skillfully and well worded each point is. A lot of thought went into that, which means there was a good deal of wordsmithing, a good deal of education, and how to use words and ideas. So in relating to those, when a question is posed and answers are given, it seems to me wording matters. So if we're looking at these charts, shouldn't we be taking with a grain of salt without knowing how the questions were posed? I'm just thinking, in all the political programs we hear, the quotes, how many people are in trouble for just one word? So wording really counts, because this is something that relates closely to what people believe and how they live. And one word can make a difference, big difference, in the meaning of a question.
Yeah, thanks, Tyrone. That's important. And I haven't looked closely into the research. He's a professor, I think, at Purdue University, if I remember correctly. But I think it's good to always check the sources, and also to realize that as we converse with others, it's easy to have an openness to a conversation or close it off, depending on the language we use and what words we use. And I think these statements were, you're right, very carefully crafted to make it clear that there is an openness and a focus on the Christian faith that doesn't deny the importance of citizenship and of patriotism, which I think is often the label that Christian nationalists will put on those who don't adhere to their understanding, is that we aren't patriotic or we aren't good citizens. And I think it's important to negate that definition, and that's part of what they've been doing in these words. But I think you're really right, Tyrone. Thank you. Words are very important, and we need to pay attention to that. Nels?
Pastor Blake, so in your opinion, are we approaching a schism within what is Christianity within the United States?
I don't know. That's a good question. Beyond my level of responsibility, I think. But I, there certainly is a a divide in Christianity over this issue, particularly that's risen in the last number of years, and it's not just you know, mainline Protestant versus other. I mean, even within the Southern Baptist Convention, you will read about leaders who are opposing Christian nationalism and those who are promoting it. And so I think this is an important distinction that people are looking at and paying attention to, and whether it will cause a break. And I think it has in some places, you know, caused pastors to be kicked out of their churches when they went against Christian nationalism that was coming up in their congregation. I've read a number of articles anecdotally about that, but I think it is a very important force that we're contending with as Christians. And that's why the urgency and the importance, I think, of trying to connect. And yeah, thanks. And I'm glad we're having, this is sort of the point of this third discussion. So is discussion. So I'm glad we're having some good conversation today.
Well, I'm just wondering how we help people understand, at least this is what I read in the book, The Power Worshippers, that maybe not all of this Christian nationalism is about power, but a big part of it, among certainly a segment of that population, is about power and control. And so how maybe this is dealt with in this study, I don't know, but it's real, and it's something that we need to think about in terms of words and how we use those words, or at least realize that that is part of what's going on. For example, there was prayer in the Oval Offices through the previous administration. Now, maybe that's been the case all along, I don't know. But it's that kind of thing that we need to also realize and be aware of as we're thinking about how we speak to this, from my perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. I mean, I know that different administrations, and Larry did a good job of going through some of this history of religion in the public sphere and in the Oval Office and in other places. But I think a number of important aspects of that Christian nationalism movement is to gain political power so that they can enforce their view of what America should be on others, rather than allowing it to be, as we know, to be a diverse nation of diverse ethnicities and religious and non-religious beliefs and those kinds of things. So that is true. I'm going to move on.
Hey, Blake.
Oh,
Blake, Bianca wanted to, there's about 10 people on the Zoom, and she wondered
great.
if you could go through kind of the list of churches one more time that were, she says the list of churches that are advocating Christian nationalism.
Yeah, that's one thing that we could work better on is having the handouts available for those on Zoom, right? I don't have the list. There's about, let's see, 20 churches listed here, most of the mainline Protestant churches.
Advocating.
Oh, I don't have that list. No, in general, I mean, it's more evangelical and non-denominational churches that may or may not be associated with a larger structure or organization is what I would say. And also there are a number of, congregations within some of these denominations as well. Tyrone.
Just a thought, going back to the wording, you just used something that, a word that comes up in political discussions for Christian nationalism, the evangelical movement. So for us in the evangelical Lutheran Church, is our name a part of a problem of our identity within today's political setting?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Pastor Ken did a whole series on that, or a talk on that a while ago. Is evangelical, what does it mean to be evangelical? And I think we take that name, and back in 1987 or whenever our church was created, as a harken back to the original church of Martin Luther, which is known in Germany as the Evangelical Church, the Church of the Good News, or the Church of the Gospel. But in our current time, evangelical generally refers to a more specific kind of Christian church that is really not theologically coherent with our theology in many ways. And so people might assume that we have a different belief setting, or many people just sort of ignore that word because it doesn't connect with what common usage would be in the American context anymore. So I think that's important. Actually, at the churchwide assembly this summer in Columbus, Ohio, the ELCA voted to create a commission to rewrite or look at rewriting our Constitution as a church, wondering if our Constitution and even the name of our church have outlived their usefulness with all the changes in society since the ELCA was formed in 1987. So there may be more coming on that particular word, but that is a word that can have a lot of stereotypes that may or may not be connected to our belief as a congregation or our denomination. All right, I'm going to move ahead a little bit. So these are our two verses that our presiding bishop will mention in a short video I'm going to show that hopefully will work. But for her, these are sort of the bare bones of what it means to talk about being a Christian, and the source of our struggle against Christian nationalism, which lifts up different sources as our gods. So you shall have no other gods before me is that obviously from the 10 Commandments. And then Jesus answered, it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him, when he was asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And so these are really the core of what it means to be Christian, is that we worship and pledge allegiance only and above all to God before anything else. And so that's the real source, the first source of opposition to Christian nationalism, which really sets aside that and says there are other allegiances that we have to our nation or to our country or to a certain set of beliefs that don't follow from these scriptural understandings. And so I'm just going to hopefully play Bishop Eaton and Bishop Curry's responses to that. Let's see. Here we go.
Since the beginning of the Christian movement, one of the earliest confessions of faith was Jesus is Lord, which was seen as a direct threat to, at that time, the Roman Empire and the emperor. It was a threat to the state. And Christians faced persecution because they declared that their primary allegiance was not to any temporal or secular government, but it was to the Lord. So that's a primary problem in all this. And for Lutherans, all of you get out your small catechisms and look up Luther's explanation of the first and second commandments. It's a perversion of how we understand that we're in fact citizens with the saints and not citizens primarily or ultimately of any one temporal government.
Bishop Curry, what would you add to that?
No, I'd want to affirm and amen that. If you look at the history of Christianity, when it has gone astray, whether it is in support of slavery or silence in the midst of evil against any people, the suppression of people, injustices, there's a consistent pattern that Jesus of Nazareth, his actual his teachings, his example, his spirit, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and goats, the Good Samaritan, that Jesus of Nazareth gets moved aside and suppressed for a broad, ambiguous Christ figure who can be adapted to any cultural context or adapted to anybody's whims. And so it is this Jesus of Nazareth, this Jesus, as Bishop Eaton has said, Christ as Lord, not Caesar. When that Jesus Christ is compromised, we're going to find danger. It is danger Will Robinson at that point. And you see it in Christian nationalism. You've seen it in all the isms where Christianity, whether it has been theological ways of being comfortable with apartheid, whether it was in the Nazi church, whether it has been in white supremacist Christianity, you name it. Every time the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount the Jesus of the parable of the Good Samaritan, the Jesus who says, you shall love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. That Jesus gets suppressed and put aside. So it is a violation of Christianity based on Jesus Christ as Lord from the very beginning. And that begins all sorts of trouble.
Amen, brother. Any responses to their two statements? Amen, I guess, right? So Bishop Curry mentioned a number of biblical texts. One of them is the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is printed here. And many of you know this story, so I'm not going to read it fully, but it's the story where a lawyer asks Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your strength and your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then he asks, who is my neighbor? And then the parable is told of a person who's taken up by bandits, beaten and left on the side of the road. And the priest and the Levite, the religious people, walk by, and it is the Samaritan who stops to help the person. And Jesus states that in this parable, it is the one who showed mercy, who proves to be a neighbor. And so what would you say are some of the key elements in this story that might help us reflect on how to be Christian in opposition to Christian nationalism? What are the two things what are some of the things that jump out at you in this biblical story that would be, if we want to be, as Bishop Curry talked about, true to the Jesus of Scripture and true to the Jesus of his teaching?
Well, I think the point the bishop made, that we kind of forget about that Jesus and that story, because it's so easy to be the priest or the Levite walking by the side of the road, not seeing our neighbors or other communities within our communities that are being put down or just struggling, and we're not reaching out to help them. And I think if you want to focus on the us, we're saved, and that might be where the Christian nationalism comes from, because we're in that group of elect people. You don't want to notice those other folks. You don't want to think of them as human, just like the Nazis portrayed the Jews and anybody else they wanted to get rid of as subhuman. The Slavs of Eastern Europe, those people were subhuman to the Nazis. I think people don't want to identify with the Nazis, but they, that kind of thinking can be very destructive and very altering of our perspective of society.
Thanks, Mark. Anyone else? What was it surprising? What's the surprising end of this parable? What's so surprising about this story? Do you remember the context of who the person was who ended up helping the person who was wounded?
This is not mine, but that basically that in modern America, it would be kind of like that old Hispanic illegal immigrant or that Muslim stopped by and helped him.
Right. The Samaritan was a cultural group that was antagonistic towards the Jewish people, and Samaritans were viewed with much disregard and looked down upon by the cultural group that was more in the center of life, the Jewish group at that time. And so the surprise is that it is not the person you would expect to help, but it is the Samaritan, the outcast, the one who normally would be looked down upon, who actually does what Jesus lifts up as the right thing, the loving and the merciful thing, the neighbor-like thing to do. And so that's something that I think this parable reminds us, is that we shouldn't, as Mark was saying, count others as less than or deny them their full humanity or their full citizenship, and also to not expect that they might be the ones who we can learn from or grow in understanding. And also it shows that I think, in the world where it was, we need to recognize that people who don't believe in our cultural or our belief system also can be good citizens, be good neighbors, which is, you don't have to be a Christian in order to be a good American or a good citizen. The Samaritan proved to be the neighbor in this story. Any other thoughts about this parable, Laura?
I think another surprise in that parable is the way mercy is held up in Jesus' last two sentences. Who was the neighbor to the man, the one who showed mercy? Mercy is not a part of society that gets stressed very much. It's dominance that gets stressed. And mercy is the opposite of dominance. And I think it's pretty stark how Jesus holds up mercy there. It's not what you think. It's not what you normally experience in your day-to-day life. It's being merciful.
I'm going to put up one other Bible quote that is from another text that Bishop Curry mentioned, the Sermon on the Mount. So this is from part of that sermon after the Beatitudes. Jesus goes on to do a number of teachings, and this is one of them. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have?" How do you think this text might influence or give light to our understanding of what it means to be a Christian and a citizen, and how to speak against Christian nationalism? One of the things in the beginning of this sentence, Jesus is making a distinction between the culturally accepted teaching of his day, "You have heard that it was said," and his radical way of treating others. What do you see in that distinction Jesus makes? Oh, Paul.
I was actually going to make a different point, if I may first.
yeah.
So, thank you, Pastor. So I think it's interesting how Jesus continually points to neighbor and is not like, this is how you should act or be in relation to government, right? So I think Jesus continues to go back and say, you can uphold your Christian ideals as a neighbor and still live within society, right? As a Christian, but not with a Christian dominated government per se. So I think Jesus is giving us, in my opinion, a pathway on how we can be both of these, somewhat synonymously, and continues to go neighbor, 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 not this is how you save your society.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes to mind when I read this is I've heard people say, "Oh, I will pray for somebody that they're opposed to," but it's not exactly the prayer or the intent that Jesus mentions here. It's when you start talking about, "Oh, I'm going to pray for him. I'm going to pray that he's going to change." No, that's not prayer in the way that Jesus was talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not prayer in the form of a neighbor.
Thanks, Nels. That's good. I appreciate that. And then we've got Laura here.
I think what Jesus is saying in the first part, you shall love your enemies. Jesus is saying, if you follow me, there is absolutely zero room for hating anybody. Nobody. You can differ with someone, you can disagree with someone, but when it morphs into hate, you have moved away from Jesus' teaching. Jesus has zero tolerance for hate.
As we look at this text, we often hear examples in our own society right now of us versus them framework in American culture. And as Nell said you know, often people, if they pray for someone, they pray for them to change, or if they don't agree with them, then we see a lot of examples that on the extreme go to hate speech and violence, but before that certainly go to saying that you are not a true American or a true Christian or a true whatever if you don't think or act or exactly like I do. And Jesus is saying something radically different here, that that even those who we may perceive as enemies or as different from us are not bereft from God's love and God's care, and shouldn't be bereft from our care either. So I think it's a really contrasting and cultural statement as much today as it was when Jesus spoke it back in the Sermon on the Mount.
I don't want to make a plug, but I'm going to make a plug for December 18th, when we're going to be experiencing in this space at the 9:15 time an intergenerational story after World War II, when the Germans had been our enemies and that war was over, and there was opportunity to be helpful and the airlift, but then also to reach out to children and things like that. So these connect, and I think the 3 sessions about Christian nationalism have given us a chance to see a continuum. But even in our other experiences, like the story for December 18th, we can keep this thread going. Stay tuned.
One of the things we can think about as Christians and as people who hear Jesus' words are who are some of the people or groups that we might love more or pray for more regularly? Are there people that we ignore or don't consider, or sort of because we're focused so much on the people nearby that we don't think about? So are there groups that we as a church or as individuals are called, or people in your personal lives that we're called to remember in prayer or seek out in love? Tyrone?
The one passage, excuse me, am I on? Yeah, the one passage in the Bible, thinking where we started here, the Christian nationalism and Christianity and government interblending. That's what we're talking about here. The one passage in the Bible that keeps coming back to me is when Jesus picked up the Roman coin and said, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, render unto God, which is God." And of course, we're trying to determine what that really is, I think, because it's just more than material things. It's what we believe. But to me, that is one time when Jesus did address the government by mentioning Caesar.
What do you think? What do you think Jesus meant with that? We've got a number of people in here who might have a comment on that, or Emily?
I had a comment on something else.
Okay.
And what I was going to say is kind of looking at this from the Sermon on the Mount. I think we look at it and we say, oh, the Christian nationalists, they have it totally wrong. They should read this and change their ways. But maybe the other way to look at it is to say, how are we feeling about them? Is this a message for people who disagree with the Christian nationalists about what that means? And not that we should agree with them, but that we should think about their humanity and maybe approach them in a different way as we kind of study these texts. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that, and I think that's part of what we're trying to work on, is how do we oppose Christian nationalism without opposing the people who are on the far right of that side of that survey, or other ways. How do we engage with them as people, and as people who have had important parts of their lives be directed in this way? How do we love them and pray for them without just focusing on our goals or our purpose? Yeah.
That seems like a great segue to the back of that one sheet you handed out, which is the replay from last week. What is a faithful response?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. I think that's really
good. That was your segue.
Yep, there we go. So, so I'm going to direct us to that. On the back side, there's a sheet that was actually a Libby Howe's handout from our first week. What is a faithful response? And she didn't get to this very much because of the time and the other information she was sharing. So I wanted to repeat it here, and we'll come back to this in a minute, because we also have Bishop Curry giving us sort of 3 ways to think about how do we interact and engage with others as we seek to take this thread of Christian nationalism seriously, but also love our neighbors and pray for them. So here's a video from Bishop Curry.
You know, remember Dr. King said, darkness cannot cast out darkness, only light can do that. Hatred cannot cast out hatred, only love can do that. We must counter these negative perversions of Christianity and of our humanity. We must counter them with an affirmative, positive way of being Christian. One, I do think Christianity must recenter itself on the teachings, the example, and the spirit of Jesus of Nazareth. I just think that that is critical. And I mean the New Testament Jesus, the one in the book, right? I mean, I'm not playing with cultural ones, not complicated, the one in the book. And I think I think this is work of positive, affirmative evangelism that grounds itself on Jesus of Nazareth and his teachings. That's one. I think the second thing is, I think we do have to call on affirmatively our common humanity, that we are all children of God, made in God's image and likeness. And that means we're brothers, sisters, we are related to each other. And then thirdly, I think we have to rebuild, and this is where it gets practical. We have to rebuild relationships between people across difference of politics, across difference of race, across difference of religion, and we have to do it intentionally. I've been inviting Episcopalians, and they've been hearing, I say, from many one, we must become e pluribus unum, and we must reach out to people who are different than we are to cultivate at least relationships across difference. And we have to do that affirmatively and intentionally and across that's one very practical thing. Everybody who knows somebody who's different than they are, get to know them. Spend some time with them. Let that become a personal value for your life. And then maybe we can begin to chip away.
Okay, so a comment: in the Nicene Creed and other portions of church services, there's little mention of the mercy and love that Jesus teaches. Is there a way to introduce those as part of what we repeat or pray in every service? Any thoughts on that comment? I think beginning with our confession and forgiveness is a way we do that in most worship services. And I hope that is part of our prayers and our preaching and the scripture readings. And we don't always do the creeds in every worship either. So, but it's important to highlight the things that are of most importance. And the creeds were written, obviously, when the church was being formed as a way to create the core foundation of our beliefs in a way that was contrasting to the culture of the time. And I think now we might want to reformulate some of those if we were going to talk about this contemporary issues and loving the Lord your God and loving your neighbor as yourself as being sort of the central foundations of our belief and our faith. You could create a creed that was very short like that. It would be interesting to do, or use that in worship sometime, wouldn't it? Yeah. What are your thoughts of Bishop Curry's charge, or his 3 points, ideas of what we should be doing as people of faith?
I think the point that he says to spend time with people that don't agree with you and get to know them is a great comment. However, when people put up extreme thoughts of hate, they kind of push you away and they don't even want to talk to you. So how do you overcome that hateful response?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think there's sort of 2 levels to this. One is the group that maybe is on the third group to the right, is, I can't remember what accommodators or something like that. I think that's the group that we want to engage with in this kind of conversation, engage with in a loving and open way, to find people who are different than us. I think the group maybe on the far right, and maybe the far right of that group that are hateful or speaking in derogatory or defaming or mean-spirited ways, that is more of the group that we want to oppose by standing up for the people who are maligned by them. And so that's the other side of this, is that we become, I think, advocates for minority groups and people who are the most disenfranchised or looked down upon, is a way to combat that, rather than engaging with someone who may threaten you or someone else personally, either mentally or emotionally or physically. That's, you don't want to put yourself in that kind of situation where you become at risk in any way. And so I think that's maybe a distinction I would make, is that we engage with people who are different from us, but those who are very, forceful or hurtful or hateful, we have to oppose by lifting up the people that are the brunt of those kinds of actions and words. Mark?
I was going to kind of answer directly to Gene to say, well, one, and this is going to sound flippant, but don't engage on social media. Talk to people one-on-one. And if you just get into a conversation with someone and they sound like they might be that way, that's the opportunity. But mostly I would say then you're going to just have to listen and then maybe ask questions. Well, are you a Christian? How does that relate to what your understanding of what Jesus wants us to do? And I guess, I don't know how that's going to be hard. But maybe that's the way I would start.
Yeah, and I think that's really good, Mark. And this sheet here talks a lot about building relationships, and those are often face-to-face or longer-term relationships, rather than what you can do over social media, which I think over and over again has proved to be a place that creates conflict and ratchets the tensions and the differences up. And I think when you're interacting interpersonally with someone in a one-to-one relationship or in a small group setting, you have a much better chance of getting through some of those walls or stereotypes that we put up. Rhoda?
I'm thinking about congregations in which this split is a huge issue. Congregations in the ELCA, and we're talking ways that I think fit our congregation, but there are congregations that are just being split apart. And I guess I'm thinking, how do we respond to that?
I appreciate Bishop Curry's comment that we need to pay attention to Jesus of Nazareth in response to the kind of Jesus Christian nationalism lifts up. But to me, if the conquering Jesus of Christian nationalism is not acceptable and gets pushed aside, then what is our understanding of Jesus? And the question I have is, there's a kind of a model of the accepting Jesus, where the pendulum swings to another extreme where Jesus accepts you no matter what. And I think we really need to, if we sweep one concept of Jesus, we really need to articulate and understand ourselves how we understand Jesus. As triumphal or accepting or divine and unconnected, or another kind of Jesus. And I think a lot of it relates to our understanding of what happens in the death and resurrection of Jesus. So those are future adult forums.
Thanks. Yep. But I think that is this core, is who do we believe Jesus is if we are followers of Jesus, and how do we live that out? And
Blake, I thank you for this, and for the adult forum for putting this together. It's interesting, we're going into a time next week when we gather as families, and families have hard times sometimes talking about these things. And so it's going to be Thanksgiving. It's going to be into Christmas when we really do a lot of those gatherings. And the guideline is, how do we do that carefully? And how do we do that faithfully to who we are?
Yeah, I think that's really true. Many of us might have opportunities to have connections with people that we don't see regularly, or maybe who are outside of our inner circle that we can have open conversations to. And how do we listen? How do we speak in a way that's not condemning, but is opening up to further conversation or relationship?
It's always meant a lot to me when I hear here at Midvale statements about, we welcome all because Jesus welcomes all. And that reminds us of that example. And it's not they and them, it is we, it is us. And when we see our role, and I think our pastors and our staff working with children and youth really model that wonderfully. And they don't say, oh, we only want parents to help out. Any person who wants to help with children and youth is welcome. So we've got a lot going on that we can thank God for, and thank each other for, and congratulate one another. So, because Jesus welcomes all.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's part of our, Bishop Curry talked about, the first thing is that positive affirmation of who Jesus is and who we are. And I think that's part of how we do that as a church at Midvale, is our welcome statement. And I think it is in our worship services and in our sermons and in the way we do our education for children and adults. And I think that's sort of a real important place that we are good at as a church, is putting forth a positive proclamation of who Jesus is and who we are as a community of faith and a community of believers. And then I think our growing edges are then, how do we interact with people who are different than us and may have different ideas? And we're fairly, as we watch the election and other things, we're very much in a fairly homogenous group in Dane County and then in our society. So it's harder, and it takes more effort to reach out to people who are different from us. And so and then the other aspect is to advocate for groups who are being abused or put down or subjugated to second-class status. And I think that's an area where we're growing, and we do a good job and can continue to do more, though, always.
I just wanted to maybe put out a suggestion for how to start that connecting process, because it is hard, and you don't start with, what do you think of the 2020 election, right? You start with, what might you have in common with somebody, even if you know that they're sort of hardwired in certain ways that you're never going to agree with them on, but, maybe you like the same sport or the same hobby, or, you can have interesting discussions and ask questions without and sort of build that foundation for a interpersonal relationship without necessarily starting with all of the hard stuff. And so that's kind of what I thought about with Bishop Curry's comments and these as well. So I wanted to offer that.
All right. Well, I think our time is about over, but obviously this is a really, we could talk a lot more, and I hope that you will in your own lives with the people, and as a church we'll continue to work on this and other areas. But I think it's a calling we all can do something about, because we all have relationships individually and of course as a church. So it's something where it's a place where we can all make a difference. And so I encourage us to do that. And thank you so much to you all for being here and investing in your time and attention to this topic together as a community. I think it'll make our church stronger as we really articulate who we are and who we believe Jesus to be, and then as we seek to engage others with that vision of who God is for us.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Pastor Blake. Next week there's no. You got it. Next week there's no forum because it'll be Thanksgiving weekend, and then Pastor Blake will be back with us on December 4th to talk about Palestine during Advent. So I'm looking forward to that. Yep. Copies on the. Thanks, everybody.